When we talk about photography, we inevitably talk about light. Of course we would. Not only is light the starting point for capturing or creating an image, the etymology of the word is a 19th century concatenation of its two Greek roots, phos for light or shining, graph for writing or drawing. But today, I want to talk about light and shadow differently. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today I'm going out on a limb, even if the title belies that thought. I want to explore a couple of foundational elements in my photography with you, light and shadow, that are also pretty much part of anyone's photography. But to do this, I'm going to abandon the more pedestrian aspects of light and shadow, things like dynamic range, metering, bracketing, to instead tell you a story of light and shadow. Now, if you have not heard this particular story before, and if you can make it all the way to the end, I encourage you to do so. You can embrace the moral of it. I promise you that it will take your photography to a completely different level, if that is what you want. I can certainly tell you that this story sits front and center in my own mind these days because I want my photography to matter. I want it to count. I want this channel to count. Yet as I'm recording this for you at the end of January 2024, I remain so far from successfully navigating the distance between my gut tells me I should be and what my head tells me I ought not to do that I am deeply, deeply torn and I'm frustrated. But hold those thoughts for another time so that I may recount for you Plato's allegory of the cave. Plato was born sometime between 428 and 423 BCE and he remains, one of the greatest ancient Greek philosophers. He was the middle generation of the Socratics, a student of Socrates, a teacher to Aristotle. He recorded more of Socrates' teachings for posterity than Socrates did himself, which is important to this story in particular, as Socrates is the main character in it. The only other character in the allegory is Glaucon, Plato's older brother, although here he is little more than window dressing a deus ex machina. Yeah, old dead white guys. But if that's what you think, then this story may be more important to you than you realize, quite likely more important for you than those of us who already know it. Although I have found it very worthwhile to go back to it and read it again. So let's get into it, and for that I'm going to use a translation from the original Greek by Sean Iyer. Think of this as a podcast, really, as I will not pepper this with B-roll. I ask instead that you use your imagination, close your eyes if you'd like, as we join Socrates and his student Glaucon for a hypothetical posited by Socrates to help Glaucon, and by extension and intention help us, understand the nature and power of knowledge, belief, and education, which, in turn, from where I sit, reminds us, in the context of this video, that we must educate ourselves to recognize the difference between light and shadow metaphorically and use that education and that discernment to inform our photography. Now, the allegory was written more than 2,000 years ago, before there was Jesus, Muhammad, Copernicus, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, Einstein, Oppenheimer, Leonard Bernstein, the Beatles, Steve Jobs, or Christopher Hitchens. Greek knowledge of other societies and their religio-philosophical giants was likely non-existent were they more than a few weeks' travel away, like, say, Confucius or Buddha. And of course, this was all pre-internet, pre-Instagram, pre-TikTok, pre-Bit or Twitter, XYZ marks the spot, whatever the heck it's being called these days, or the iPhone. You get the idea. So please do try to suspend the very natural tendency to stop listening as soon as it sounds different from today's lexicon or understanding of science or religion, and stay with it to the end. Allow me to draw a comparison in order to understand the effects of learning, or the lack thereof, upon our nature. Imagine that there are people living in a cave deep underground. The cavern has a mouth that opens to the light above, and a passage exists from this all the way down to the people. They have lived here from infancy, with their legs and necks bound in chains. They cannot move. All they can do is stare directly forward as the chains stop them from turning their heads around. Imagine that far above and behind them blazes a great fire. Between this fire and the captives, a low partition is erected along a path, something like puppeteers use to conceal themselves during their shows. I can picture it. Look, and you will also see other people carrying objects back and forth along the partition, things of every kind. Images of people and animals, carved in stone and wood and other materials. Some of these other people speak, while others remain silent. A bizarre situation for some unusual captives. So we are. Now, tell me if you suppose it's possible that these captives ever saw anything of themselves or one another, other than the shadows flitting across the cavern wall before them. Certainly not, for they are restrained all their lives with their heads facing forward only. And that would be just as true for the objects moving to and fro behind them? Certainly. Now, if they could speak, would you say that these captives would imagine that the names they gave to the things they were able to see applied to real things? It would have to be so. And if a sound reverberated through their cavern from one of those others passing behind the partition, do you suppose that the captives would think anything but the passing shadow was what really made the sound? No, by Zeus. Then, undoubtedly, such captives would consider the truth to be nothing but the shadows of the carved objects? Most certainly. Look again, and think about what would happen if they were released from these chains and these misconceptions. Imagine one of them is set free from his shackles and immediately made to stand up and bend his neck around, to take steps to gaze up toward the fire. And all of this was painful, and the glare from the light made him unable to see the objects that cast the shadows he once beheld. What do you think his reaction would be if someone informed him that everything he had formerly known was illusion and delusion, but that now he was a few steps closer to reality, oriented now toward things that were more authentic and able to see more truly? And even further, if one would direct his attention to the artificial figures passing to and fro and ask him what their names are, would this man not be at a loss to do so? Would he rather believe that the shadows he formerly knew were more real than the objects now being shown to him? Much more real. Now, if he was forced to look directly at the firelight, wouldn't his eyes be pained? Wouldn't he turn away and run back to those things which he normally perceived and understand them as more defined and clearer than the things now being brought to his attention? That's right. Now, let's say that he is forcibly dragged up the steep climb out of the cavern and firmly held until he finally stands in the light of the sun. Don't you think that he would be agitated and even begin to complain? Under that light, would his eyes not be nearly blinded, unable to discern any of those things that we ourselves call real? No, he wouldn't see them at first. It would take time, I suppose, for him to get used to seeing higher things. In the beginning, he might only trace the shadows, then reflections of people and other things in the water. Next, he would come to see the things themselves. Then he would behold the heavenly bodies and the heaven itself by night, seeing the light of the stars and the moon with greater ease than the sun and its light by day. Indeed so. And then, I think, he would at last be able to gaze upon the sun itself, neither as reflected water nor as a phantom image in some other place, but in its own place as it really is. Undeniably. And now he will begin to reason. He will find that the sun is the source for the seasons and the years, and governor of every visible thing, and is ultimately the origin of everything previously known. Of course, first he would see and then draw conclusions. That being the case, should he remember his fellow prisoners and their original dwelling and what was accepted as wisdom in that setting, don't you imagine he would consider himself fortunate for this transformation and feel pity for the captives? I agree. Now, suppose there were honors and awards among the captives, which they granted as prizes to one another for being the best at recognizing the various shadows passing by or deciphering their patterns, their order, and the relationships among them, and therefore best at predicting what shadow would be seen next. Do you believe that our liberated man would be much concerned with such honors, or that he would be jealous of those who received them, or that he would strive to be like those who were lauded by the captives and enjoyed pride of place among them? Or would he rather take Homer's view and rather wish in earthly life to be the humble serf of a landless man and suffer whatever he had to, instead of holding the views of the captives and returning to that state of being? Truly, he would rather suffer a great deal than return to such a life. Well, here's something else to consider. If such a man would suddenly go from the sunlight to once more descend to his original circumstances, wouldn't his vision be obscured by the darkness? It obviously would. And so, let's say he is with the captives and gets put into the position of interpreting the wall shadows. His eyes are still adjusting to the darkness, and it may take a while before they are. Wouldn't he become a laughingstock? Wouldn't they say, "You have returned from your adventure up there with ruined eyes"? Would they not say that the ascent was a waste of time? And if they had the opportunity, do you suppose that they might raise their hands against him and kill this person who is trying to liberate them to a higher plane? I'm afraid so. Then, my friend Glaucon, this image applies to everything we've been discussing. It compares the visible world to the underground cavern, and the power of the sun to the fire that burned in the cavern. You won't misunderstand me if you connect the captive's ascent to be the ascent of the soul to the intelligible world. This is how I believe, and I shared it at your wish, though heaven knows whether it is at all true. Regardless, it appears to me that in the realm of what can be known, the idea of the good is discovered last of all, and it only perceived with great difficulty. But when it is seen, it leads us directly to the finding that it is the universal cause of all that is right and beautiful. It is the source of visible light and the master of the same, and in the intelligible world, it is the master of truth and reason. And whoever, in private or public, would behave in a sensible way will keep this idea in focus. I agree to the extent I can manage to understand. Stay with me then for another thought. We should not be surprised that individuals who have reached this level might be unwilling to spend their time on mundane affairs, for would it not be that their souls always feel a calling to the higher things? If our illustration holds true, that would seem quite likely. Yes, likely indeed. Now, would it be at all surprising for one who has been engaged in the contemplation of holy things, when he ventures into ways of degenerate humanity, to appear ridiculous in his actions? What if, for example, while his eyes were still adjusting to the mundane gloom, he would be forced to appear in court to hold forth about the mere shadows of justice or the other shapes that flitted across the wall, and to engage in debate about such concepts with the minds of others who have never beheld the ideal justice? It would not surprise me in the least. But one who has his wits about him would remember that there are two things that pain the eyes: being brought from the darkness to light and transitioning back from light to darkness. Now, considering that the soul experiences the same discomfort, this man would not make light of another when he met with a confused soul. He would take the time to understand if that soul was coming from a luminous realm and his eyes were blinded by darkness, or whether journeying from the darkness of ignorance into an illuminated state had overwhelmed his eyes. One he would consider fortunate. He would pity the other, and if he laughed at either, it would be less justified if he laughed at the expense of the one who was descending from the light above. That's a fitting way to put it. Of course, if I'm correct, then some of our educators are mistaken in their view that it is possible to implant knowledge into a person that wasn't there originally, like vision into the eyes of a blind man. That's what they say. What our message now signifies is that the ability and means of learning is already present in this soul. As the eye could not turn from darkness to light unless the whole body moved, so it is that the mind can only turn around from the world of becoming to that of being by a movement of the whole soul. The soul must learn by degrees to endure the contemplation of being and the luminous realms. This is the good. Agreed? Agreed. Therefore, of this matter itself. There must be a craft of some kind which would be a most efficient and effective means of transforming the soul. It would not be an art that gives the soul vision, but a craft at labor under the assumption that the soul has its own innate vision, but does not apply it properly. There must be some kind of means for bringing this about. Yes, such a craft must exist. Look, there's more than one reason why most of us don't choose to go into philosophy, never mind the ancient Greek philosophers. And I am, in any event, mindful of Shakespeare's observation in As You Like It that the fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. Which, wonderful turn of a phrase as it is and not without merit, is also a paradox. Anyway, first, it took several readings for me to interpret this very last bit about how to learn, mistaken educators, the soul, crafted labor, blah, 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 blah. If not wholly to my satisfaction, at least I came close enough given the deadline I imposed upon myself for getting this out. Second, congratulations for making it this far. Third, my ambition, my hope, is that at any number of points along the way, this dialogue has prompted you to think not in the abstract, nor in terms of aesthetics or equipment, but in a very practical way about what is happening in the world today and your role in it as a photographer and a human being. If it has, then what I will say next may resonate more deeply with you, but if it has not, perhaps what I say next, what I leave you with, may inspire you at some later date to think a little bit more about this. I will not ask you to hold this last thought any longer. I think it is the sum total of one's life experiences that determines who you are at any given point in time. B, exceptional teachers and mentors can help us become the best versions of ourselves. Poor teachers can hurt us almost irreparably. C, although in the end, we are responsible for who we are, no one else. D, I also think that who you are determines what you see and how you see it, both as a photographer and, again, more importantly, as a human being. Just as it is for the people in Plato's cave, one's ability to discern what is light and what is shadow, that is, what is real and what is false, is critically important in pursuit of being a good and worthwhile person. This will show up in your photography. This is one of the very highest uses of our time, which is to make and then act upon well-considered decisions. And I would argue, perhaps the most important thing for those of us in pursuit of the very highest forms of photography, which I think are to inform and generate emotion. I think the need to properly discriminate between what is real and what is not has never been more urgent than now. An Orwellian era of doublethink and newspeak writ large by social media narrowcasting, amoral entertainment masquerading as news, unlimited campaign finance, too rapidly evolving artificial intelligence. I think the Luddites were terribly underrated. And widespread efforts by the few to delegitimize everything for the many, even asking us with far too high a success rate to disbelieve our own eyes by substituting one set of shadows for another. As it turns out, a commitment to truth, the importance of intellectual humility, the need to do the work to see things and understand them clearly, the courage to break free of the chains of ignorance, the curiosity and ability to seek out the proper guidance to approach the unknown, all in service, in the end, of making considered decisions and acting upon them for the good and beautiful, are the morals not only of the allegory of the cave, but some of them, anyway, of the parable of the blind men and an elephant for which this channel is named. Personally, I love and am mesmerized by the light and shadows in the glass, steel, and concrete canyons of New York. But the big deal, the foundation for finding one's own artistic voice and leveling up one's photography, I think, is the metaphor of light and shadow. It is orders of magnitude more important than any piece of kit, any instruction on how to use any piece of kit, any understanding of rules, say, for composition or the geometry, shape, and juxtaposition of actual light and shadow within a frame. These are elements of craft. Then again, maybe not. Very few of us take up photography for this purpose. Very few of us have either the time or inclination to pursue it. And most of us are perfectly happy to capture family, friends, and adventures, and that's fine. All good. Still, I think the metaphor of light and shadow, intentional or not, helped to illuminate, I can't help myself, continues to illuminate the best work of photographers like Cartier-Bresson, Alfred Eisenstadt, Dorothea Lange, Robert Capa, Robert Frank, Martin Parr, Sebastião Salgado, and others. I mean, just look at their best work. Learn about that work. Learn their personal stories and how they came to be the photographers they were. They are. And, oh, by the way, if this makes sense to you, if it resonates with you, you just might want to check out one of our street photography workshops. Not that I'd intended to mention them at all. I hadn't. But after spending so much time thinking about this video, writing the script for it, sitting with it, recording it, spending so much time editing it, I do have, at the very least, a better sense of why our workshops are, quite selfishly, I'm now talking about just for Claudia and myself, the highlight of our year. It has something to do with getting out there in the real world, getting outside of our own heads, experiencing life directly from multiple angles, allowing us in the end to better see, more deeply learn, make more carefully considered decisions and act upon them in the service of what is good and beautiful, unfettered by the chains of our daily existence, all the while supporting and being supported by, sharing our passions and enthusiasms with what always turn out to be an exceptional group of wonderful people. We end up teaching each other.